Story 1. I answered the phone, and it was my aunt calling from Florida. My parents had planned a long driving trip to see her. She was calling to say that maybe now wasn't a good time to visit. It only took 30 seconds for it to turn into a rant about not really wanting them in her house to flat out insults about every wrong thing they had ever done to her. When the rant ended, I said, "They left an hour ago." My aunt said, "Let's just make this our little secret, okay?" and hung up. Story 2. I stole this tape they bought that taught couples some new techniques to spice up their life. They were demonstrated by two real people, so it was porn. I let a friend hold it, and he lost it. I'm sure they know, but I will never admit it. Story 3. Had skipped school, and the school called my dad to ask why I didn't show up. So he calls me and says, "Why the hell aren't you at school?" So I told him that I'm actually on a field trip and that they should know that. And he says, "Okay, let me talk to your teacher." So I was in downtown, and there was no shortage of homeless people. So I asked one if he'll pretend to be my teacher for $5. He sold it perfectly, and my dad apologized to me. Story 4. When I was 14, I left the house at 1 in the morning to hang out with friends in an empty field and watch a meteor shower, which I had ironically been grounded from seeing with my family due to sneaking out to hang out in the woods. I went out my window. It was difficult, and I needed help from my friends due to being a twig, and then came in through the back door at 3. Left it unlocked. Nearly got caught, but told my dad I had simply been taking the dog out, which he believed since I'd done that before. Never snuck out again though, due to the scare of nearly being caught. Story 5. When I was a kid, we were on my dad's boat far out at sea. He asked me to take the wheel. After about 5 minutes, I saw a big log floating, and I steered into it and hit it with the prop, hard. I had seen a cartoon where they did this, and it just turned the log into toothpicks. However, it didn't do that. We had to get towed in by the Coast Guard. Story 6. My super religious father has no idea how drunk I got in high school. I think my mom knew, but she definitely never told my dad, most likely to save me from the hell he'd put me through. Story 7. I got so drunk and one night, I let a raccoon in the house because I thought it was my dog. I got the raccoon out, but the raccoon ripped up the couch. I just flipped the couch pillows over. It's been a year, and they still haven't found out. Story 8. I lied when I said they repaid me for half of my sister's wedding dinner. My dad was somewhat forced into early retirement, and while splitting the dinner bill wouldn't change things overall, I did not want him stretching his retirement money to cover something I could afford to pay for in full. Story 9. When I was a junior in high school, I bought a dog at a flea market for $20. I rubbed some dirt on her, brought her home, and told my parents she was a stray I found at a friend's house. They still have no idea. Story 10. I remember the day you adopted me. I never told them. They gave me all the love that shaped me as a person. Surely they had their reasons, which I will never question, for never saying it during their lives. They passed away several years ago, and I will miss them every single day of my life. Sometimes parents don't need to know any secrets, because there's a good chance they already know or have deduced it long before you've even considered telling them. They love you unconditionally. It is your sole decision to share something with them or not. Story 11. I burned the house down and not the Christmas tree. I left the lights on without putting water in it. I was playing with the dog and we knocked over something. A spark was created, and then the fire on Christmas Eve. I told my parents it just sparked and started. My parents got a divorce soon after that. Not sure if I caused that too, but life has been really since that point. Story 12. Made out with one of my mom's friends. Looking back at it, I do regret it, and I'm not proud of it. She was super hot, but I'm glad it just stayed as making out multiple times over the course of the summer, and nothing more. We almost had sex, but fortunately I didn't have condoms, and so I turned her down. Ultimately, it turns out she was f***ing crazy, in my experience. She always seemed normal to everyone else, though. Story 13. I had a huge problem with alcohol. They might have been suspecting it, but I was always able to control it when I needed to, so they didn't catch on. One night, we were in a club, and I drank way too much, more than I ever did. So at like 4 a.m., everyone had gone home except for some dudes smoking outside. I went up to them and asked them which way is home. Long story short, I ended up taking a pill with them, which to this day I have no idea what it was. I completely lost track of everything. Next thing I knew, they were also gone, and I had no idea where I was. I freaked out. I was already pretty much out of my drunk mind, but the hours before were missing. It was dark, and I was in another town, as I didn't recognize anything around me. I've dealt with depression before, but right then and there, it just hit me so hard, I couldn't believe what I was feeling. So I just went on some long road until I saw a truck coming my way. Then I found myself standing in front of it, waiting for it to hit me head on. The truck stopped. The guy saw me all along and had just enough time to stop. What I'm sure about is that I wasn't counting for that to happen, but just accepted it. That is very much me in many situations, which are never this drastic, of course, that I'm convinced I meant it seriously in those moments. So, what happened is, I walked up to the dude and asked him for directions. Luckily, while lurking around, I was actually making my way back into my town. I still had to walk 2+ hours home, but getting in bed that night, or day, was the best feeling I've ever felt. So, yeah, I am not ever telling them this one. There's no telling what they gave you. Alcohol can screw with so many meds that it can take something relatively benign, like Xanax, and turn it into a monster. The severe and immediate depression that followed would make sense to me as some sort of mood elevator, but I'm not a professional, and I'm taking a wild guess. Story 14. When I was younger, maybe 10 or 11, I had been eating bagels for a week straight. They were so good. Cream cheese slathered all over. One morning, my dad said no more bagels for a few days, and I said okay. But when he went upstairs, I had a bagel. He'll never know. Story 15. When I was 10, I went on our old sailboat with my parents and sister for the weekend. When we got back, I ran ahead to the car while my parents unloaded at the dock. I fancied myself a locksmith, I guess, and decided to pick the lock on the trunk of our 1980s Caprice Classic. With a stick. I decided to unlock the trunk of the car with a stick. Well, needless to say, it didn't work, and also, I broke a stick off in the lock. So my parents get to the car, and for some reason, the key doesn't work, and we have a giant pile of bags and large coolers. My dad proceeds to fiddle with the key and lock, tries to pry the trunk open, and cusses for what seems like hours. It's getting dark. Dad is still cussing. He finally manages to pry the rear of the back seat forward, and there's a tiny gap to the trunk. I'm convinced to crawl through into a pitch black trunk and try to open it. I get in somehow. Eventually, I brace myself on my hands and knees, arch my back, push as hard as I can, and the trunk opens. We load up the trunk, tie it down with a bungee cord, and drive the 2 hours home. Dad is still cussing. I will never tell him. Story 16. When I was a teenager, I once stole a cucumber from the crisper to use as a dildo. I threw it out the window when my parents came home early. My mom was so confused that the cucumber was missing, which made me feel pretty guilty. Then, a while later, she was equally confused as to why there were cucumbers growing in her garden. She served those magic cucumbers to so many people, family meals, church potlucks, etc. Story 17. It was me that pissed in the trash can next to the toilet, and not the dog. I was 6. They still tell the story to this day because the dog was infamous for doing crazy shit. Story 18. As I was packing my bag that I was going to take to the hotel with my soon-to-be wife on our wedding night, my dad put a bottle of champagne in it and said it was to make things go easier the first night. I just said, well, thank you, as I was surprised that he didn't seem to at least suspect that we had been having sex for over 2 years. I wasn't going to tell him then, and I never did. Story 19. That I tried every single drug I was able to get my hands on at some point in my life, except heroin. My former flatmate and I had over 100 marijuana plants in a hidden room in our building's basement, and we paid our way through college with our production. Afterwards, I did cocaine for years with the guys I worked with. My parents still congratulate me for never falling into drugs, unlike my aunt and uncle, whose lives were destroyed by heroin. Story 20. That I suffer from ADHD and take medication and see a counselor for it, and have been doing so for the last few years. They're retired middle school teachers, but they're old school. They think that only a very small percentage of ADHD kids are diagnosed correctly, and that most of them just need good parental discipline. They're getting on in their years, not sure what kind of cognitive dissonance it would cause them to realize that one of their own children should have been treated with meds and counseling. It's really best for us all if they never find out. Story 21. I never told my dad I was twice in high school. Because the one time me and my ex almost had sex, he took off the condom and I flipped out. And me thinking I could trust my dad, I let him know in a really awkward way, and he shamed me for it. Stood outside the Walgreens, handed me $100 like it was a drug deal, and told me to go get a plan B. He wouldn't even go inside with me since I was so scared. After that, I knew I could never trust him again. P.S. If you're a father and your daughter comes to you with something so important and scary, please, please, please be kind. Story 22. Long time ago, I chucked a pack over a prison wall for a local gang for some cash. The pack was intercepted, leaving the guys who hired me to think I'd stolen from them. Ended up with a bounty on my head. Moved to a foreign country at 17 years of age, and got stuck out there for longer than anticipated due to COVID. So yeah, they still believe it was for a massage course. Kinda like my dad. My dad was working for the mob and didn't tell his parents. They decked out his car to the max so that he could keep being their courier. Well, he turned around and raced it instead, ultimately crashing it into a boulder. The mob didn't touch people in the military, so my dad joined the Marines. His parents thought he just signed up because of Vietnam, which threw my grandpa into an absolute fit because as a World War II and Korean vet, he never wanted his kids to have that life, so his dad disowned him anyway. Oh, and mom later divorced dad and went out with a mob boss until he died of a heart attack. Story 23. I texted my mother's ex-boss back when I was 5 years old and asked him for an opportunity to return to her job because I didn't want her and my father to keep fighting. Her previous job was 900 kilometers away and can only go home for 2 weeks every 6 months. I deleted the message immediately, but her ex-boss responded and she took the job. I only saw my mom twice a year then, but her and my father's relationship got better. They are both now happy in retirement. Story 24. I was an only child, age 10 or so, with my mom, and I was tired of her working all the time. So one day, I took her car keys and threw them. I mean threw them into our heavily wooded backyard, so she would spend more time with me and less at work. The next day, she freaked the out, of course, and was downright distraught. She was eventually able to get a taxi to work, but I felt bad, so I went out to go find the keys I threw. Long story short, I couldn't find the keys, and she got fired from her good-paying job. We had to downgrade our house to a shitty apartment, and she had to work crazy amounts of overtime at a shitty grocery store. All because I threw her keys. I tried several times to tell her, but I just couldn't ever get the words out. Story 25. I was generally a really well-behaved kid, and I never got into much trouble. As a result, my parents trusted me way too much and would frequently leave to spend weekends with friends at the casino or on little trips. Most of the time, I just enjoyed having the house to just me and the dog, and played video games and watched scary movies. But one time, when I was in 9th grade, I mentioned to a friend that I had the house to myself the entire weekend. My parents had always warned me against saying that I had the house to myself around others for this exact reason. My friends convinced me to seize the opportunity, and we threw an absolute rager at the house, and invited literally everyone we knew. I was a busboy at a restaurant, and for some reason, I invited all the line cooks who were like in their 20s. Well, everyone and their brother came to my house that night. No exaggeration, probably over 60 people. The line cooks came and brought a ton of and alcohol and invited their friends once they realized we had a pool. It actually went fairly well, and I definitely gained some popularity points at school, and most of my friends and the line cook stayed behind to help clean up before my parents came home. I told them I had some friends over, which they had said was okay as long as I told them who it was. But they could sort of tell some shit had gone down, but didn't quite know what. Eventually, my stepdad found a cooler with a red ring around the top of it that had been used for jungle juice, and he questioned me about it like an interrogator. But I held my ground. They called my friends and my friends' parents, and they didn't snitch either. I got in trouble because they knew I had some sort of get-together. But to this day, they have no idea the level of sheer havoc that took place that night. Story 26. My parents think we're close. My parents and my brother came to the United States with no job, no car, and no place to live. They left me in our home country less than a month after I was born. After 3 years, they came back and got me. I never bonded with them. I was a troublemaker that didn't listen to them. They gave me a good life, and though they didn't have anything when they came to the States, they lived the American dream and retired as millionaires. We chat on the phone every now and again, and we say I love you to each other. They never said those words until they retired and moved back to our home country. But I only say it to be polite. I don't actually have any feelings towards them. It's like I'm indifferent or something.